So thanks, Gail, and the Eclipse Foundation for inviting me to speak here today. And I hope what I'm going to say here today can be kind of a useful primer when thinking about in particular open source and AI in the context of EU digital policy. Because of course, for many engineers and business leaders, public policy can be a bit of an afterthought, especially in such a rapidly developing technology field as AI. But I will also say that there's a flip side to this, and that means in practice that while policymakers rave about the potential of AI to bring about, a digital transformation and maybe even revolution in Europe, the way these technologies are actually developed is not always known or understood. And I think this especially goes for open source now when it's gone from being a bit on the fringe to being mainstream. And I think this is more noticeable in the market than in, let's say, the policy arena. So this means that, as I see it, there's this knowledge gap between policymakers and the open source stakeholders. And both sides are responsible to bridge this knowledge gap. And the overarching point that I would like to do or make today here is that all of the stakeholders that engage with open source and the open source ecosystem, both as users and as vendors and developers, can do a lot to increase policymakers' knowledge and understanding of open source, and especially how it plays a key role in key challenges and opportunities such as AI and the digital transformation in general. So to illustrate the points that I'm making, I'm going to do a little bit of storytelling. And this might be bringing up a little bit of old news for some, but I spent quite a lot of time trying to learn some lessons from this. And to initiate this, next slide, please. There's this key question that I've been thinking about for the last 2 years. And that is, why did open source software development end up as an unintended casualty in the original proposal of the Copyright Directive? So this is a little bit of EU policy going deep into it, but I think you'll see my point later on. Because I invite you to think about this question in the context of digital policy in general. Politicians across the world, and especially in the EU, rave about the important role of artificial intelligence in digitizing our societies. And these are the same AI technologies that are heavily dependent on open source solutions. Yet, when proposing a copyright directive a few years back, no one thought about software, which, mind you, is regulated by copyright. So simply put, had open source policy advocates not spotted the risks that the copyright directive posed to the software development platforms that developers rely on to collaborate, GitLab, Gitty, GitHub, these platforms risked being regulated out of practical existence. And so thinking about this question has brought me to the idea, or perhaps the general argument that I'll try to make here today. And that is, while the realities of innovation in software has evolved over the years, simply put, open source software is more mainstream than ever, policymakers have not kept up in terms of knowledge. This was true for the Copyright Directive, but it's still true for basically the entire policy realm. Okay, so this is probably not news to anyone. There's a knowledge discrepancy in tech policy. But what I would also like to argue, which could perhaps be a bit more controversial, is that open source advocacy has not followed the times either. And I'll get into that later in the presentation. But I really want to stress how important it is for open source and openness advocacy to step up its game in the coming years. Because with open source going mainstream, there are new risks and there are new opportunities. The political conversation around open source, I think it has to go beyond what it has focused on in the past and start to become an acknowledged part of the strategies for Europe's digital future. So to be part of that conversation, the open source ecosystem needs to build the capacity to become trusted partners of governments and public authorities in order to capture the big political opportunities that are out there. So super quickly, just a parenthesis, I guess, but let me introduce myself and Open Forum Europe, the think tank that I work for. Yeah, my name is Astor Nummelin Carlberg. I'm the policy director here since almost 3 years now. And for the last 15 years or so, Open Forum Europe has devoted its time to explaining the merits of openness in computing to politicians and legislators across Europe. So our vision is to facilitate an open and competitive choice for IT users. So this includes what I will talk about here today, open source software, but we also have and work a lot with open standards, procurement policy, cloud, internet, artificial intelligence, everywhere where openness is relevant. Next slide, please, Deb. So, okay, the copyright directive. Which, just a quick update, it has become EU law and it's currently in the process of being transposed into national law, which means that it was decided on an EU level and now it's up to the national parliaments to turn that EU law into national law. And in the last few months of negotiations in Brussels, so or a little bit more than a year ago, this directive received a lot of public attention, which is not super common for EU laws at the point of negotiation. But as some of you in the audience might know, the directive had been going through the policy processes for many years before it gained public attention. And when it was proposed in 2016, its critics were fast to point out two things. It failed to present reforms that would create a real single market for copyright, while at the same time it introduced some very far-reaching changes to copyright liability and new rights for publishers. And in my view, the law tries to do essentially one thing, and that is to strengthen the negotiation position of European rights holders industries in order to move money from large American internet giants, so mainly Google and Facebook, to the European rights holders industries. And this was to be done by introducing two very controversial articles in this law. So Article 11, which is called the link tax, or the neighboring right for publishers, and Article 13, which also known as the censorship machines, but was legally speaking a liability shift for platforms when it came to user uploaded material. And in many ways, what this was is a technocratic solution from the European Commission to a very specific problem formulated by rights holders. And the problem was, however, that this problem description was very limited. And I've had a few meetings with the Commission lawyers that actually wrote the proposal, and they are very skilled IP lawyers. So, you know, in their defense, they were presented with a specific problem, and they did provide a solution to the problem as it was described. So then what was our problem? Well, it had to do with the unintended consequences. And one of the most controversial points here was Article 13. It's called Article 17 now. But this article introduced this liability shift that I mentioned, and that will lead to an obligation on platforms to mass filter content uploaded by users. And there's a lot to say about this, but for the sake of this talk, let's focus on what it meant for code sharing platforms and code repositories. And what we learned was that nobody in drafting this law ever thought of software development platforms, or software for that matter, as copyrightable material. And it wasn't disregarded, it was simply forgotten. Because the original proposal I was put forward by the European Commission, it would have required software development platforms and code repositories like GitLab, like GitHub, to scan and automatically remove code that got stuck in the filters. And this could inadvertently break software due to the current lack of effective filtering technologies for code. So there's a high rate of false positives. And this is in software development, that it's collaborative. It's not as simple as an upload download, as there's like a complex ecosystem of tools that interact with these repositories. Well, so in response to this, my organization OFE, together with the Free Software Foundation Europe, we launched the SaveCodeShare.eu campaign. Next slide, please, Gail. So together with Europe's network of very active and great free and open source software activists and advocates, we organized several meetings and calls in Brussels, in the member state capitals. We sent letters. And after, I think it took about a year, we managed to get the case of open source software development on the political agenda. Remember, it's some big giants battling it out. So fighting for open source software development platforms was just getting some attention, and being on the agenda took quite a lot of work. And there was broad support across the political spectrum of the critical importance of open source software development when we explained it to them. And there was recognition that it's important, that it should not fall within the scope of the copyright directive. And this is also noteworthy. It means that nobody intended to regulate code repositories. Everybody agreed that this is something worth protecting. But then, one would have hoped that it was that easy, because when the council, which is where the EU governments negotiate the legal proposal, as opposed to the European Parliament, is the two institutions engaged at this point. While most governments wanted to respect their pledge to open source, the first negotiation mandate undermined their commitment. And this was largely due to a misunderstanding of the mainstream commercial nature of open source software today. And it also was a result of them not really understanding the broader collaborative dynamics of the software industry in Europe and globally. So they only excluded non-for-profit software development platforms, which in effect would have meant, goodbye to functional GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, etc. So why did I engage in all of this storytelling? Well, from running this campaign, there are two main observations that I really would like to underscore, and they both lead to the same conclusion. Next slide, please. And the first observation is simply that open source software development platforms became an unintended consequence of the copyright directive. And this is in a time when the Commission also pushes for European innovation in not just AI, but across all digital verticals and society, IoT, smart cities, smart mobility, where software is part of the digital transformation. And all of these are also heavily dependent on open source. And here, my second observation is that even when they realized that this was important, they still didn't manage to get the text right, since they don't understand the ecosystem within which software is developed today. So the conclusion is simply that the analytical tools used to solve different policy issues are still a bit analog. I feel like our experience gave us a very clear example of policymakers under pressure, trying to regulate the tech industry, being under a lot of public and political pressure. They're entering into this conversation with a lack of knowledge and awareness and understanding of the open source ecosystem. So, okay, surprise, surprise, we have a knowledge discrepancy between digital innovation on the one hand and digital policymaking on the other. Next slide, please. So I hope that this story can kind of serve a little a little bit as a backdrop when we look into the future a little bit, to the challenges and opportunities for open source in Europe that we have on the table today. And so for the sake of the presentation, I've divided up the opportunities and challenges here. But in reality is that they're all a result of the mainstreaming of open source. So as open source has gotten big, there are some fundamental political dynamics that have changed. So next slide, please. So the EU governments are stepping up to regulate the tech space. And this development has, by some, been referred to as the age of regulation. It sounds quite dramatic, but essentially there's a lot of activity going on. And so in Brussels, where I'm based, there are some big pieces of legislation that are being prepared in order to, for example, hold platforms more responsible, regulate AI development, as Barry mentioned, regulate how data is handled and how data is shared, and to create a new industrial strategy based on the digital transformation, et cetera, et cetera. And the current public health crisis has actually sped up many of these developments rather than slow them down. And so, having gone through the process with the copyright directive, which only touched on kind of one sector and fairly specific things, I know that these broader moves taking place, we will see unintended consequences, which might harm open and collaborative software development. And of what we know right now, I would say that the sources of concern are, on the one hand, the Digital Services Act, which is touching the entire platform ecosystem. But we're also expecting a legislative follow-up to the Commission's AI white paper. All this is, in less than a year's time. And I will also not spend too much time speculating about the details of these upcoming legal proposals, because I think there's a more general point to be made, and that is that there's so much regulatory seal at the moment, and this, together with the lack of understanding of open source and open technologies in general that I spoke of, I would say that there are new levels of political risks. There's simply more regulation coming. And in other words, when we see digitization of society as a whole, especially with the rollout of AI solutions in a broad, in almost all sectors of society, be it digital health, agriculture, smart cities, you name it, it is very difficult to predict where the regulatory risk will come from, because the sources of political risk multiply as you get big. So think about this in the context of open source AI. Regulatory risks to AI development do not only come from AI-focused policy initiatives. Risks to the fundamental model of collaborative development could lie in just general sloppily drafted liability regulations in any of the above-mentioned fields, if it's not taken into consideration. Next slide, please. So is it all doom and gloom? No, I don't think so. What is actually the European Commission doing right now? And I would say that parts of the Commission and some very important players are starting to waking up to the strategic potential that lies in open source when solving the challenges that the EU faces in digital policy. Digital policy, it's now been presented by the European Commission, and it's been the reality. It has turned geopolitical, and this has been put on the forefront of the political agenda of the new Commission that took its seat not too many months ago. And there's a new kind of concept or leitmotif that is touching almost everything digital, and that is digital sovereignty, or digital autonomy or independence. But digital sovereignty is a term that you see all over the place, especially in the digital strategies put forward in February this year. So the big kind of direction that the new Commission wants to take. And this goes from efforts on digital tax to platform regulation, as well as thoughts around spurring European efforts in AI. But since this is an open source AI event, and we are Open Forum Europe, I will hone in on open source again. And I think it was notable that open source was essentially never mentioned in the strategies put forward in February, as opposed to other modes of that are involved in collaborative software development, such as just more formal ICT standardization. But that being said, there are some very positive signs still. Last November, the Commission hosted its biggest open source conference to date. It was called Open Source Beyond 2020. And just as a kind of interesting tidbit, I think the Commission expected there to be a lot of interest, but they ended up having, I think, twice or maybe 3 times as many people registering to the event than could actually attend, despite the added overflow rooms and everything. And I think this interest from the community and all the stakeholders out there was very much noted by the Commission. And they saw the energy that is out there in the open source communities. And so this workshop focused very clearly on what the European Commission could do for open source software development, as well as hardware, should be also be noted, in Europe. And in return, and here is where I think it also gets very interesting, is what can open source do for Europe's citizens by pushing our general development. And at the same time as this is happening, when the Commission is looking to the community for input, they have also, and they're in the process of they're conducting a study, and it's the first study of the impact of open source software and hardware on the European economy, on its role in European competitiveness and European technological independence. And this is currently being run, we are part of the consortium at Open Forum Europe together with Fraunhofer ISI. And this is expected to be done in the beginning of next year. And this is important, I believe, and it's especially important in the political space, because kind of what you can't measure, you can't create policy or understand. And there hasn't been an EU-wide study of open source proper since 2008. And I think you can imagine that there's been some major changes in the marketplace since then. And this study is meant to steer, and this is been made very explicit by the Commission, to steer the Commission's open source policy work for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah,
and the,
I think, Astor.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to conclude.
Okay, we need to conclude. Okay, yeah. Very good. Then let's jump ahead a little bit. We can go to the next slide.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So what is it the Commission wants to do very in a nutshell? And that they want to hear and they want to know what open source can do for Europe on a strategic level. And the reality is that open source software has gone mainstream and has consequently increased its potential political power. But a lot of open source advocacy looks the same as it did 10, 15 years ago. There are calls for action online, there are open letters, meetups, and don't get me wrong, this kind of activism is extremely important, but it is reactive and not proactive. In order to stop the political risks that are out there or engage with them and be taken into consideration, we need to move beyond being reactive. We can't just be forgotten as open source is part of the broader digital transformation in reality. We should have been in 2014 in the meeting with the Commission and solved the problems with the copyright directive at the source. And this is what effective and modern advocacy can help doing. Looking to the long term, in the age of regulation, digital sovereignty, AI regulation, the open source communities will need to work to bridge the knowledge gap and step up its game. And that needs, that means a new way of communicating with governments and parliamentarians. It means, new levels of funding behind policy organizations, presentations, and a new level of engagement. So to everyone in the audience here, and here's where I will round off and make it a bit practical, what can actually be done? I would like to offer that anyone that cares about open source software in the AI space, that goes for both users of open source solutions as well as vendors of open source solutions, is to work with the policymakers. And if you're a developer, engage with your policy team and government relation teams at your company, and educate your policy team in the importance of open source and how collaborative innovation matters for the innovativeness of your company. And if you have and run an open source software vendor SME, or engage with your national open source business alliance, create the infrastructure to mature open source advocacy to make sure that the important and mature role open source holds in the marketplace is reflected in the political discussions as well. So that was a quick summary of the end, but we can also leave a bunch of things to the panel if you have any questions. So let's move on.
And
Thanks.
You'll come back in a future edition to talk about Abel. And
yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Astor.